is really looking more at the data belonging to the person, all right, the person's data, and they should have the right to determine how it flows, who gets it, where it goes, that type of thing. All right. There are many concerns that people have in this regard. Strangers getting hold of their data. You know, we hear a lot about people being impersonated. All right. Identity theft is probably the buzzword for that one. And people just are concerned with loss of individuality. Their private business now, which was not made public, being out there in the public domain. All right, so that one's there. The second bullet point you see there, freedom from interference and surveillance. All right, and we know we hear a lot about this, especially in developed countries. Current U.S. president, you know, has done a lot of that, indicating how he was spied upon, his phones were tapped. I think we even had it in our local election campaign recently, you know, those sort of accusations. But notwithstanding that, you know, people are concerned about being watched and spied upon, especially if they are not aware, because then they don't know what information is being gathered and what it is going to be used for, or what it could be used for. This obviously impacts upon governments as well, because very often governments are the ones that people are sometimes suspicious of in terms of, you know, this type of surveillance and interference. And we recently had that coming at us as well, when the Barbados government had made the declaration of plans to fingerprint all Barbadians, you know, at the point of entry via the immigration office. So, you know, persons were concerned about that. Was this fingerprinting going to be used for? What can it be used for, etc.? So all that is surveillance and personal autonomy. We all like to feel that, you know, we have some say over what we do, and, you know, where our data is and what people know about us. Yes, proceed. Right, so privacy, of course, is very complex. It's dynamic. Perceptions or our understanding of privacy is something that changes. What privacy meant to the average person, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, is totally different now. And this is, you know, because we have a lot more sharing, a lot more opportunity to do that. A lot more systems are interconnected. And the first bullet point there, if you really study it, then there's a lot of data that people may have on us that we consider or may be able to consider as inconsequential. In other words, if somebody happens to know how old you are, or, you know, how many children you have, that may or may not be a big problem for you. All right, there's no universal definition. As I gave you 3 just now, and there are more. And therefore, revision, social revision is not uncommon. So you can expect this to change. And within the context of the GDPR, we've definitely seen a change here. All right, because GDPR is not the first piece of legislation to come out of Europe on this whole matter. All right, but things have changed. And maybe an area that we are lacking here is that most people have a strong desire for legal protection. Now, you know, miscreants and other persons who are desirous of taking your data and doing nefarious things with it are there. All right, if they see an opportunity, especially an opportunity to make money, all right, several people will, well, people who think like that, you know, will take advantage of the opportunity. But the other question we have to pose now, what if they're caught? What do you do? All right? In our circumstance right now, the police usually will have to find the closest fitting piece of legislation to charge them under, because we don't have our data privacy or data protection legislation in place. Okay? Now, what I want to bring home to you is this. I submit to you that this whole area of privacy and the GDPR is, from the perspective of a business organization, it is a business problem. It's not an IT problem. Stephen already alluded to that just now. It is, and I am repeating it, I'm re-emphasizing it, it is not an IT problem, right? Businesses, we have Facebook, and businesses like that, you know, they're always trying to find creative and innovative ways to use your data, all right, for their business model so they can realize profits, all right? And they're trying to do that without infringing your rights. Does that sound like an IT problem to anybody? You would call an IT person to try to, you know, put that in place or resolve that? Probably not. All right. Organizational guidelines, policies, procedures for how data is managed. Sounds very much like a a business problem to me. All right. How is data managed? What are the practices? What are the policies in place? What are the guidelines? All right. IT people are not usually the ones who are called to write these policies. Having an officer responsible for managing the process or processes, that also is strictly under the business category. Training is important. Persons are employed to handle sensitive data, personal identifiable data, PII, or PID, sometimes it's called. All right, and these persons are in the bank. These, as Stephen gave the illustration, these persons are in doctor's office, dentist's office, and you know, these people are handling, even when you go to buy something on hire purchase, you know, you get that form and a lot of questions, and there are a lot of questions that identify you. I mean, they need to identify you in case, you know, they need to get in contact with you. What about the persons who are handling that data? So they need to be trained. There must be a corporate culture put in place. Ethics, what are the ethics of the organization? All right. What sanctions are there in case somebody runs afoul and breach the regulations? Again, not IT. All right. I have HR there. So yes, any HR, I don't know if we have any HR people in here, but this is an area where HR should be intimately involved. Of course, the legal officers, the legal department, that needs to be, those persons need to be involved as well. And yes, there's an impact on ICT, as we will see. But I hope I have been able to convince you that this is a business issue and not an IT issue. Once you put it in the realm of IT, you are starting wrong, if that's where you start, and you will end wrong. All right? Yes. Okay. There are a number of regulations within the GDPR. I've just picked out one or two here and there, and I've done that really to kind of support the points that I've been giving you so far. So this one, I'll just run through it quickly. This one says guidance on the implementation of appropriate measures and on the demonstration of compliance by the controller or the processor, especially as regards the identification of the risk-related processing, their assessment in terms of origin, nature, so on and so forth. Guidelines provided in particular by means of approved codes of conduct, approved certifications, guidelines provided by the board, or indications provided by a data protection officer. The board may also issue guidelines on processing operations that are considered to be unlikely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, so on and so forth. All right? So the board is mentioned within one of the regulations of the GDPR. Hence, a business issue. From the board, it needs to start from the top. All right? They're not the ones who say, all right, we'll let IT handle that. I mean, it's interesting that BIPA is actually hosting this event, all right? But, you know, it needs to start from the board. It needs to start from the top. It needs to be policy decisions, board decisions, executive decisions. Of course, IT, you know, should be in there just like HR, so that we get a comprehensive plan of action. All right, next slide, please. All right. It was not meant for you to see it. Like I said, I just brought this to show that, you know, the points that I was making earlier are not done in a vacuum, but they're all related. So this one, the highlight here, this is talking about a personal data breach. All right. If not addressed in a timely and appropriate manner, and all the rest of it there, limiting their rights, discrimination, so on and so forth. Loss of confidentiality, protected by professional secrecy. Let's see, the main point here. Right, therefore, as soon as the controller becomes aware, all right, and we have the 72 hours listed there, which you would have heard about earlier. All right, where such notification cannot be achieved within 72 hours, the reasons for the delay should accompany the notification. Again, these are company policies. These are organizational policies. So really and truly, these are provisions, all right, that organizations really should have started to implement even prior to the GDPR, all right? But lots of organizations, not only in Barbados, not only in the Caribbean, but around the world, are lacking in a lot of these written procedures, largely, well, I say largely, from my perspective and having been on the ground for all these years, there's still a hands-off, too much of a hands-off approach by upper management, by boards, when it comes to matters that involve IT. All right, not that they're IT matters, just so happens that they involve IT. Next slide. So where's compliance in all of this? Well, it is necessary, but it's not the place to start. Again, I go back to saying this is a business issue. This needs to start with the board and the senior executives. In other words, just because there's a GDPR, you shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't say, all right, IT, go and get us compliant, you know, and leave it at that. That is a flawed approach. That's a recipe for disaster. Okay? All right, compliance is something that should be tested and proved, and that's, you know, a requirement. So you don't just say, well, okay, I put in a firewall or I encrypt the data, so I must be compliant. No, you need to be able to test and prove that you are compliant. All right? The authority and responsibility for this should be assigned to a real person. All right? It shouldn't be like, well, somebody, some department, you know. There needs to be an identifiable person or persons, well, a person, because ultimately the buck needs to stop at somebody. So it should be a person who can be identified that is an employee of the organization that has the authority and the responsibility. Could be separate persons. One person could have the authority, the other person has the responsibility, whatever. But we need to identify those players. And periodic evaluation, which you heard mentioned earlier, that's a must. It's not a static thing. You don't become compliant today, pass everything, and never look back at it again. Doesn't work that way. You make a change to your policies and procedures. It doesn't even have to be external. Bring in new computer systems, new software, whatever. That could change your security and your compliance posture. All right? So you need to keep re-evaluating it. So what's the impact on ICT? Well, this is where the security comes in. So after all the policies and procedures have been developed and agreed upon, signed off by senior management and approved by the board and all of that, security. The security team of the IT will then take care of matters as it relates to digital data, because obviously there's still paper documents, you know, and you need to also remember those, all right? But under the purview of IT, you will have measures to, you know, thwart any attacks, your antivirus, your encryption, firewalls, intrusion, detection, so on and so forth. Early detection of suspicious behavior is always good, to be proactive. Security risk management is actually mentioned within the GDPR. In other words, what we're talking about here is calculating the risk, all right, that a breach could occur, that an attack could be successful, all right? And there are procedures and ways to do that. But that is in the GDPR to assess your risk. In other words, the GDPR is not saying that, well, if a breach ever occurred, that's it, you're dead. They recognize that nothing is 100% safe. The GDPR is not going to make, you know, all these attacks go away. It's not going to make all the breaches that we've heard disappear, all right? So assessing the risk, there's a probability that it will occur, but what you want to do is minimize that probability, and that's where your security risk management comes in. Data loss and data leakage prevention. Again, persons are authorized to handle payroll and other sensitive information, but you have to make sure that they're not just emailing it, posting it on social media, and doing whatever they feel like, all right, just because they have full rights and full access to it. So that's where that comes in. Breach alerts, you need to know that a breach has occurred so you can comply with the provisions and that 72-hour requirement. In other words, the newspapers shouldn't find out that you had a breach before you, especially if you are the boss and all that. Forensics, where you can now investigate what has happened, who did it, when, where, that type of thing, so that you can remediate, stop it, or, you know, put measures in place to lower the risk of it happening again. And reporting, reporting is a big part of the GDPR. Next slide, please. All right, on-site storage, cloud storage. I mean, these are significant, especially as you move more to the cloud. That changes, you know, your posture as far as data privacy and security is concerned tremendously. So with things like the GDPR, if you are doing business with EU citizens, you need to make sure before you migrate everything to the cloud that you bear in mind the implications of that. Next slide. All right. This regulation here, this supports, let's see. Right. This is where it says the control process should evaluate the risks inherent in processing and implement measures to mitigate those risks, such as encryption. All right. Encryption is just one, but that is in the GDPR. All right, so it's there. All right, it goes on to tell you, in assessing the data risks, consideration should be given to the risks that are presented by personal data processing, such as accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, and so on and so forth. All right, so it's there in the GDPR. Next slide. All right, so after all that, I actually finally got around to saying what the GDPR is. I mentioned before that the GDPR is not the first. Europe had Data Protection Act. The US has been, far ahead in putting these sort of regulations, these measures in place. Europe came somewhat afterward, but they had their Data Protection Act. This replaces that, and what it does, what they had before really was what they called a directive. All right, another word for that is a framework. So members of the EU were able to come up with their own laws for their territories, and it was based largely on the framework. So there were, differences between France and UK and Spain and all that. What the GDPR seeks to do is unify all of that. So one regulation governs the EU area. Bullet point 3 is applicable to any company doing business with a resident of the EU. One of the challenges that security professionals have faced, especially with international business, is this whole question of jurisdiction. And for example, you have all the laws in the world, and anybody in your country does something nefarious, they're caught, you bring down the hammer on them. But if if a country like Barbados wants to do business with you, and they don't have anything in place, then even if somebody is found out, what do you do? That's been a problem. Not necessarily for Barbados per se, but there are certain countries that have, reputations, China and Russia and all that, for, launching attacks from their end, because even if they're caught, what's going to happen, kind of thing. So right now, what we have is the law is not, GDPR is not based on jurisdiction. Wherever an EU citizen goes, the law goes with them. All right? So that has changed the paradigm in that respect. All right? Next. Okay, some of the key provisions. I think this is probably the last or second to last slide. You've heard some of them before. There are many more. Just re-emphasizing. Consent, all right, doesn't necessarily mean that before you can do business with an EU citizen and you want to know their name, that you have to, say, all right, click here. And not necessarily that detailed, although it could be, but you need to ensure that persons either can read clearly before they proceed any further, that by proceeding further, you have consented, to provide this information to us. Or sometimes you need to have a button where they have to click, so that it didn't happen automatically. It didn't happen just because they went on the website or whatever. They had to actually take some action. Breach notification, we dealt with that. Right to access, right to be forgotten. Privacy by design. Again, that points back to a business issue. All right? And these are provisions in there. So when you're coming up with procedures and models and e-commerce, whatever, privacy by design. In other words, this needs to be a corporate policy. You need to have a data protection officer. There's a little debate around that. Anyhow, and also that implies the data protection impact assessment, all right, which the GDPR speaks to. They strongly recommend that you do that as part of getting ready for the GDPR. And this is where a lot of the money that would have been mentioned earlier, lies as companies, and of course it depends on the size, scope, how international it is, how big it is. That could be a fairly significant exercise to carry out that impact assessment. Next slide. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for that very comprehensive, yes, review of the GDPR. The right to be forgotten. I just like to bring the anecdotal perspectives to this. Some years ago, my best friend, I'm sure when I say some years ago, I'm going to mention something else now. Rented videotapes from Chubby's. Remember Chubby's? Y'all are here old. Okay. All right. Because that's my daughter, Chubby. My daughter know who Chubby's is? Well, she rented tapes. My best friend rented tapes from Chubby's. And about a couple of months later, Fit will have it, they closed down. So he had the tapes. The system was still there in terms of then the credit bureau. So a month, days passed, he did not return the tapes. So about 2 years later, getting married and everything, he then went to courts to rent some furniture, only to find out that he owed Chubby's about $600 in tips, based on the fact the system did not update to reflect the fact the place is no longer in business. So that part with the right to be forgotten cannot be understated, because he couldn't get furniture because he owed for videotapes. You know how ridiculous that is? Tapes don't exist no more. But because there's no regulation that says a citizen has a right to be forgotten, he had bad credit over tapes. And there's where I'm going to pick up my friend in the audience that represents Massey. Massey has one of the biggest data sets and data records on citizens, and there's no regulation for it. That's why I don't have a Massey card. I'm serious. Not until we have data laws am I getting a Massey card. I have no choice but to do business with the bank. I have to write checks. But there's no way that someone can have information on me and I cannot compel them to tell them what information are you storing on me, who you're sharing that information with, and for what purpose. It's a very serious thing. Because they can say, this is what it is. But you know what? It might not be the full scope of what they tell me. But if there's a law that says you must declare to Stephen Williams all of the information you have on me, then they're free to tell me whatever they feel like. And that's a problem. Moving swiftly along, and I'm begging my audience, in the interest of time, chop it down. Whatever it is, cut it in half. Right? Sorry, we move on to David in the order. So there's an order here, and I'm trying to stick to the order. And David, I'm sorry. Andy took up your time. But I know you can do equally well. Please.
All right, good night. All right, I'm an information security professional. I want to look at this from the information security thing. I'd like to agree with virtually everything they said. GDPR is a very big problem that we have. It's very serious, and it will impact us even though we're not in the EU because we're a tourism place. We also do business. We have international business, so as long as you're dealing with EU citizens, it's going to impact you. Now, Andy said that it is a business issue and not an IT issue. That is 100% true, but I would also say it's a government issue because it's being tackled everywhere else on the government level. Government is we want to put in legislation that follows or fits in with GDPR. Also, countries supposed to have what is called a supervisory authority, right? That would be established by a government. So if all the companies themselves wanted to get ready for GDPR and government does nothing, we're in a lot of trouble. So that is very serious. GDPR deals with data, not only electronic data. If it's written, something in the filing system, it still falls under GDPR, which is another reason it's not strictly IT. It also deals with only personal data, which is the good thing. They're only interested in data that can identify you. Name, in some cases, my IP address, your telephone